Hello and welcome to our webinar on Thursday, the 12th of August, China in Africa, Unpacking the Enviro-Crimes. We would, as always, like to thank our sponsors, Ipcc, for making this conversation possible. And so to get right into it, our esteemed guests today, first of all, William Laurance, Bill Laurance, all the way from Queensland in Australia. William Laurance is a distinguished research professor and Australian laureate at James Cook University in Cairns, Australia, and also holds the Prince Bernhard Chair in International Nature Conservation at Utrecht University, Netherlands. He received the Heineken Environment Prize and BBVA Frontiers in Ecology and Conservation Biology Award for his efforts to promote tropical nature conservation. And it really is an honor to have you here with us today, Bill. Pooven Moodley, who is known to many of our Burning Planet readers, is a human rights lawyer and social justice activist from South Africa. Before joining Natural Justice as executive director, he was the associate country director of Oxfam in South Africa and the global head of campaigning for Action Aid International. He most recently led with other activists the successful campaign for a just energy future to stop South Africa's proposed massive nuclear deal with the Russians, and victory was achieved there against all odds. So welcome, Pooven.
Thank you.
To get right into it, Bill, so in a searing piece for Yale 360, published in March 2017 under the title "The Dark Legacy of China's Drive for Global Resources," Bill Laurance gives us the following opening paragraph. For the past 35 years, I've worked as an ecologist in the Amazon, Africa, and the Asia-Pacific region on an array of environmental issues, mostly revolving around tropical forests, biodiversity, and the drivers of land use and climate change. I've seen many things, some good, some amazing, some heartrending, but I've never seen a nation have such an overwhelming impact on the earth as China does now. So that's a lot of experience and a lot of traveling, Bill. Can you briefly expand on that last line?
Yeah, sure, Kevin. China, has just become this juggernaut of economic activity, but also development pressure around the world. Of course, it's the most populous nation on earth, close to 1.5 billion people now. It's had escalating economic growth even in this last year with all the COVID issues, rapidly increasing carbon emissions. It now is overwhelmingly the biggest carbon polluter in the world, produces about 2.5 times as much carbon emissions as the United States does. It's got this Belt and Road Initiative, which is absolutely a global planet changer. The BRI could ultimately end up costing many trillions of dollars, possibly as much as $8 trillion. It's currently developed or involved in 138 different nations all around the world. So the Belt and Road is bringing in massive developments: roads, highways, coal-fired generating plants, hydroelectric dams, other kinds of infrastructure and development, extractive industries. China is overwhelmingly the world's biggest consumer of illegal wildlife trade. And there's problems within China are really exacerbated by the lack of an open media there and by the president, Xi Jinping's really iron rule, which doesn't allow much latitude for free thinking within China and really prevents the Chinese people from understanding the implications of everything that they're doing in the planet right now. They are simply not hearing anything close to a realistic picture of what's happening.
Thank you for that, Bill. And we're gonna do a deep dive in, but just to get from Pooven picking up on that, you've worked in over 20 countries, campaigning on local and global levels with a vast range of communities and activists. The issues that you've dealt with includes women's rights to land in Africa, the role of large mining companies in destroying indigenous communities and the environment, people's right to health and education, repression by governments, and climate change. In your not insignificant experience, how does China fit into all of this?
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, just I think to set this conversation in context, I think, to start off by saying I mean, this has to be an extraordinary conversation. We're living in an extraordinary time, and we know we'll never go back to normal. And with the IPCC report that's just come out, you know, it further consolidates where we're at. And I think the Burning Planet, through you and others, over the years have done a fantastic job to paint the picture, you know, to tell us that the writing is on the wall, which we know it is now. And so, you know, fitting China into that type of scenario is quite important. Many years ago, as I was doing work in Mozambique, and I was in Manica province, and, you know, having lunch with some of the community members, and, you know, every hour I'd see these trucks going past, and then, you know, I'd ask people there, you know, where are these trucks going to? And the answer was these trucks are being filled with logs going to the harbor or to the port, and from there to China. And over the last, you know, many years, I've seen this happening in most countries that I work in. And so it's clear that, you know, that level of extraction, as we know, isn't sustainable. You know, it's everything from forests to sand to stone to you know, fossil fuels, etc. That's being extracted. And this Belt and Road Initiative is operating in over 36 countries in Africa. And, you know, the key part here is, you know, obviously the environmental devastation, but also it's presented as, you know, obviously something that's economically good for the continent. But the bottom line is, if you look at many countries, you know, the financing is coming in the form of loans, right? And every country on this continent has been affected by the IMF, World Bank loans. And now on top of that, we have these loans. And, you know, the consequences that we've seen in Zambia recently with the airport issue, in Sri Lanka with the port, Mozambique. I mean, we're seeing it all over. These are loans, these are, you know, takeovers that are happening.
Yeah, thank you, Pooven. And I mean, I can certainly vouch for everything you're saying. Myself and Richard Poplak spent 7 years traveling Africa from 2009 to 2016, interrogating Africa 3.0, an investigation into Africa in the 21st century. And the major theme there has to be China, and it has to be the infrastructure for resources swap model. And we certainly saw across 18 countries everything that you're talking about. But what we weren't looking at then, because we were looking at the politics and the economics of it, was the environmental degradation. So just to give the context, and you mentioned at the beginning of your response there, is this latest IPCC report and where we stand in August 2021. So this latest report is simply devastating, and it's been making headlines across the world with the pronouncement that humanity's failure to act has now caused unprecedented and irreversible change to the climate, i.e. we can't reverse the damage that's already been done. But none of the state culprits are named. China, with carbon emissions of 14.4 million metric tons per year, is currently responsible for almost a third of that ongoing human-induced damage. And in 2020, while almost every other nation dropped its emissions thanks to COVID-19, China's rose by 1.7%. Then on Tuesday this week, the day after the IPCC report was released, China's foreign ministry stated it wouldn't be making any changes to its policy. It emphasized that coal consumption would continue to increase until 2026, peaking in 2030, with the net zero target by 2060 still in place. So given the crazy wildfires we're now seeing in Greece, Turkey, and Siberia, the floods in Germany last month, the heat dome that parked over the Pacific Northwest the month before that, and not to mention the latest warning signs of a possible collapse in the Atlantic Gulf Stream, which would be absolutely devastating. I mean, it could push North America into an ice age. And the science on that is very, very worrying. So the question is, how does the rest of the world hold China to account? And to you, Bill, is it even possible for the nations of the world to do that?
Well, it's a little bit like trying to wrestle a 900-pound grizzly bear. I mean, you know, it's a massive challenge. It's just an extremely difficult reality to try to undertake. As we mentioned already, China's got a notoriously closed media, and the public, and especially under President Xi Jinping, has become increasingly indoctrinated in many aspects of Chinese policy. And what it does is it tends to make them increasingly intransigent and difficult about many issues which they might otherwise pay attention to. As you mentioned, Kevin, the Belt and Road Initiative is one of the biggest contributors to global warming that we have right now, because it's responsible for such a large expansion of coal-fired generating plants. Of course, coal being the dirtiest of all the fossil fuels. Now, clearly, look, there's no way to get to pressure China on its own. I think all nations need to contribute in terms of reducing emissions and or funding that they might use for things like forest carbon trading. But as long as, if nations can keep pressing for decarbonization and divesting in investments in carbon and reducing their carbon emissions, while trying continually to reach out to China. And I really do think it's an exceptional challenge right now, and it's just such a big one, such a massive one, that we've got to keep our hands in it. But it's going to be a big challenge.
Indeed. So, Pooven, you've had quite a bit of experience dealing with environmental issues at the UN, and what do you expect to happen at COP26 with regards to China? How's that going to play out?
Just to say a couple of things. I think what we've seen with the climate negotiations over the years is that the ambition is really low. It is a negotiation between different parties, that come together, and often it's the lowest common denominator. I think the other factor that we see is based on these science reports is that there's an acceleration of the breakdown that's happening, and I think these negotiations can't keep up. But just to say a couple of things about the upcoming COP. So I sit on this COP President's Advisory Council. We meet once a month with the COP President. And what's, the thing we push very hard is around fossil fuels in terms of stopping coal completely, stopping the financing of coal, but also on oil and gas. And there have been quite a bit of developments over the last few months, if you've been following the G7 in terms of the divestment from coal and coal financing, but also similar discussions with at the G20 with also environmental and energy ministers. The challenge, as we've seen in the build-up to the next COP, is that already certain countries, China, Russia, India, for example, are completely against this idea, or for coal to stop anytime soon, or to put a concrete timetable, and that's going to be the challenge going into COP. That there will certainly be countries like China that won't agree to concrete deadlines, etc., given the amount of investment, as we know, in Africa in terms of coal and other types of fossil fuels.
So I mean, we've certainly seen no good news come out of any of the COPs. If we're watching the emissions graph just continue to go up, and the first COP was in 1992, and the science was in way before that. So statesmanship is really not getting us to where we need to go, and very often it's going in the other direction. I mean, at 2009 in Copenhagen, you had the BRICS nations. You had Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa basically selling out the rest of the world. So you had these five of the biggest developing states agreeing to Barack Obama's targets and selling out the rest of the G77 and the island nation states. And what basically happened there was that hard targets for nations were taken off the table. And then you had these voluntary emission targets. And here we sit 12 years later in, what is, without any hyperbole, possibly the worst news that humanity's ever got. We got on Monday. And it's just amazing that we're going into COP26 under these conditions. So, we'll come back to how victories can be won. I know both of you have victories under your belt, but just to go back into, these planetary boundaries. And thanks to David Attenborough, we know a lot about the 9 planetary boundaries that humanity can't afford to cross. And according to some, we've crossed 4 of them. According to others, we've crossed 6 of them. But Bill, given your experience, can you speak a bit about the link between biodiversity loss and climate collapse, specifically with regards to China's involvement in Africa?
Okay, well, firstly, I'll just make that direct connection. Look, we know that, for instance, firstly, just to put climate change in context. So traditionally, historically, and I mean in the last century or the last several decades, we have been transforming the planet via changes in land use, by overexploitation of wildlife, by a variety of means. Climate has been increasingly growing as a key driver over the last few decades, and we're now starting to see temperature records breaking all kinds of records. Of course, the catastrophic fires and other kinds of things that we've been seeing happening. So climate change probably historically has not been a massive driver, but it's growing. And what especially worries me is this notion that we might see synergisms or interactions in the future between our traditional changes like land use and overexploitation and climate change. Just as an example, when you go in and fragment a forest, when people go in and they develop it, they log it, they do farming, they typically chop up the forest they clear a lot of the forest and they create little patches left over. Turns out that those patches of forest are extremely vulnerable to droughts and fires. So if you happen to be unlucky enough to get a drought occurring within in that same area, you can get a terrible, hugely destructive synergism between fragmentation and fire, habitat fragmentation and fire. So I am really worried about these potential future interactions between climate change and land use, because they can cause such complex and in some cases unanticipated changes that it really does force us to be on our guard and worrying about changes that might come flying out of the blue and hitting us in the back of the head.
Thank you, Bill. And I mean, just also to pick up on that, you've worked in the Amazon, but the world's second lung is the Congo rainforest, and the rate of deforestation there is a story that is being severely underreported. Do you have any insight into what's happening?
Yeah, well, we work a fair bit in the Congo. A year or two ago, we published a paper which showed how fast roads, particularly logging roads, were expanding in the Congo Basin. And I think we found about 50,000 kilometers of new roads in the last 10 years. And there was about another 100,000 kilometers there before. So we're talking about roads exploding, and then realize that in addition to having slash and burn farmers moving into the forest and causing lots of problems, you've also got hunters. But unfortunately, the hunters have got much more lethal technologies than they ever did traditionally. So they've got automatic rifles, they've got cable and wire snares. And as a consequence of this, we've seen large wildlife, for instance, the Africa's forest elephants, which only live in the Congo Basin in West Africa, their global population has collapsed by 2/3 over the last 10 years. So hunting and roads is another example of a synergism, and it really is taking a terrible toll.
That's terrible news, and it's certainly a story I think we need to pick up on our burning planet. So hopefully we can take this offline and get access to some of your contacts. That would be really appreciated. But onto some good news here, Pooven. You had a major victory a few years ago on the coal plant that a couple of Chinese multinationals plan to build in the Lamu archipelago off the Kenyan coast. So how did you secure that victory, first of all, and what damage would it have wrought had it gone ahead? And I mean, I'm really interested in hearing the details of how that victory was secured. So take your time with this answer. It's a really important answer, and it was a really big victory.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. It's Lamu, as many of you know, is a small island. It's a World Heritage Site. It's the oldest Swahili settlement anyway. And what we have here is a typical example of the Belt and Road Initiative. You've got, firstly, oil from Lake Turkana, that region, and because of that, you've got these massive roads and railways that are being built across the country that ends up in Lamu. You have this massive port development that's backed by the Chinese and others, which tries to then ensure all of the resources in terms of Somalia, Ethiopia, Tanzania, etc., would be able to then access and use this port for that level of extraction. And so you've got a range of things happening. On top of that, was this proposed coal plant. And this coal plant would have then provided energy and electricity to run some of the port and other aspects. It's something that Kenya doesn't need, and something that the community in Lamu certainly didn't want. And this has been a resistance over about a 10-year period. And the community of Lamu, really, it was a David and Goliath kind of story, where they came together. One day there was a bulldozer on a farmer's land. The community didn't know what was going on, and only when they asked the driver and then started realizing what was going on, that the land was taken over, it was given away to the Ports Authority. The ocean was being dredged without the community being consulted, etc. And so over a period of time, the community, the farmers, the women from that community, young people, the fisher folk started organizing themselves and formed themselves into something called Save Lamu, which is now an amazing organization that's providing the frontline resistance. And through that came this decolonize campaign to stop this coal plant. And it became a national campaign and a really effective campaign with a range of communities and organizations being part of it. And then part of the strategy and where we kind of fit in as natural justice was, working on the legal side in terms of communities knowing what their rights are, in terms of communities for themselves developing their own vision of what they want. And so part of that was going to court as well, because the fisher folk there, livelihoods were devastated because of the dredging and what would happen in that port, farmers that had lost their land. So it's been, a long journey and a long process. But in terms of the coal plant itself, there was a lot of mobilization, a lot of resistance across the country. It became a global kind of campaign. And with Katiba Institute, Natural Justice went to court. And it was an incredible victory. The small community taking on the Chinese, and a lot of this was going to be also funded by the African Development Bank, etc. And because of this resistance, this court victory, the African Development Bank pulled out. The Chinese are now rethinking. It would have been the first coal plant in East Africa. So that's put a line in the sand, based on these communities. And I think it's given other communities, across the continent hope that, some of these things can be challenged.
Where do we stand now with that, Poof? I mean, what's the latest?
So the latest is it's just gone quiet since the court case. One doesn't know what's happening behind the scenes in Beijing or somewhere else. But so far, it's gone quiet. We're keeping obviously a close eye. Just to see if there would be any new developments, we would certainly challenge. But, like with this, what happens is, the money goes somewhere else, right, for the next investment. And, we're seeing that with oil and gas. I mean, we're currently in the East Africa court trying to stop this oil pipeline between Uganda and Tanzania. Yeah. But, the investment just keeps going somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. And had that Lamu coal plant gone ahead, what sort of devastation would we have seen in that archipelago?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the community themselves, it would be mass devastation. It's such a biosensitive area. I mean, already we've still seen a lot of destruction with the massive amounts of mangroves being decimated already, which is having an impact. The ocean sea life is already damaged to some extent. But I think this coal plant would have just pushed it, like we're seeing in other countries in terms of corals dying, in terms of, the just basic rights to a healthy environment. I mean, the number of people that are dying now because of breathing issues, as an example. And I think it would have really tipped the balance in this very sensitive biodiverse area.
And of course, there's a major historical irony there. Emperor Zheng He and Admiral Zheng He coming down in the Star Raft in 1415, and Philip Snow, C.P. Snow's son, writes that book and has the most memorable opening line. In 1415, while Henry V's army was trudging through the mud at Agincourt, a giraffe arrived in Peking, and you still have evidence there of it was the biggest ocean-going fleet that the world had ever seen and would ever see until World War I. And something like 30,000 sailors passed down, and 400 ships in around between 1410 and 1420 passed down that East African littoral. And there was absolutely no impetus towards colonization. It was a voyage of exploration to show that they could do it. And, there's still much evidence of it that you'll find in those museums there. I mean, I remember we were there 2012, 2013, and we're just absolutely blown away by this evidence and all the porcelain and this interaction that the world had forgotten, because, of course, 60 years later, you've got the Portuguese who are coming in and pretty much doing what the Chinese are doing now. It's an incredible irony, and again, just an incredible victory, and I think a very important test case. It shows what can be done with the correct pressure from the environmental activists on the ground legally. So yeah, really well done. But moving on from there now, I want to ask you both, what are the sites of most concern in Africa right now when it comes to Chinese intervention? And Bill, in your vast experience, which is the one to watch? Which is the most concerning development?
Well, I would say the road and rail projects that are crisscrossing Africa very rapidly now, very oftentimes the Chinese investment or active construction would be the thing we most worry about. We find that in a lot of frontier areas, remote areas, that new roads can open up a Pandora's box of environmental problems, such as illegal colonization, illegal deforestation, poaching activity, illegal mining activity, land speculation. I mean, oftentimes at great impacts on local indigenous peoples and rural residents. So right now, if you just look at the projects that are underway, under construction, there's several major road and rail projects in West Africa, which are absolutely critical area, tropical region that's a global biodiversity hotspot. Also, there's several routes, I would say especially problematic in places like Kenya, Tanzania, and several other countries in that vicinity in East Africa. And then also getting into Central West Africa, in projects in Nigeria, Gabon, Congo, which is some of the most biologically critical areas of the Congo Basin. So it's a target-rich environment if you want to try to identify places that are of concern. And the thing is, it's just going to advance faster and faster in the future. Yeah.
I see we've got a question here from Dominic Naidu. Any sources on Chinese fishing fleets off South Africa's coast? So, just picking up from there, Bill. In 2010, it was a story that I covered off the Mozambican coast, and you had these Chinese longliners that during the day would anchor beyond the horizon, but at night would come in with these massive spotlights, and they were shark fishing vessels. And I remember diving off that coast of Tofu in the late 90s, and those coral reefs were just incredibly rich. The colors were amazing.
Another fleet
and
has increased massively, hugely, in the last 2 or 3 decades. China is also very actively now working around the world to try to open up and fund and control ports in different parts of the world. But yeah, look, China's been castigated for fishing activity in places in Africa, in Madagascar. There's been a lot of controversy about it, and other places too, I'm sure, because the China fishing fleet, the industrial fishing fleet, is very active and very aggressive. I know in Australia, there's concern that China is potentially moving more rapidly into the Antarctic Ocean. And they're also funding a lot of infrastructure and other activity there. And so even though China's not part of the Antarctic Treaty, they're trying to bull their way in and gain some control. So anyway, bottom line is, look, a lot of stuff's happening very rapidly, and very often, not always, but very often.
We seem to have lost Bill on voice there. Bill, if you can hear us, if you could refresh your screen. But just to pick up again on that story, off the Mozambican coast, they didn't have a navy, so there were a couple of maritimos, the maritime officers, who had one quad bike to patrol 250 kilometers of coast. So it was basically impossible to police those illegal fishing fleets, and they are illegal. In South Africa, it's a bit different. We do have a navy. And, to come back to Dominic Naidu's question, any sources on Chinese fishing fleets off South Africa's coast? So we were seeing these fishing fleets off of the south coast in KZN. And our navy did manage to chase down and impound some of these longline trawlers. And I haven't seen any evidence recently of an uptick in that activity, but perhaps I'm wrong. Perhaps the South Durban Community Alliance and those guys, Desmond Desar, could enlighten us if they're watching. But over to you, Poov. I mean, in your experience, what are the sites or these sites of the most concern right now in Africa regarding Chinese intervention?
Just to build on what Bill was saying, I mean, we're certainly keeping an eye on West Africa, from Senegal to Nigeria, that whole zone. It's something we're quite involved in and challenging. On the East Africa, as Bill mentioned as well, definitely Uganda, Tanzania, Ethiopia, Kenya, that kind of zone is a lot of investment going in there. But certainly in Southern Africa, I think, if you look at, from South Africa with the Messina Mercado, which, you are quite involved in, but also people like Makoma and Center for Environmental Rights and so on, going up, Mozambique, as we all been following what's been happening there, that's intensifying and going further up that coastline. So, I think it's concerning across different parts. And just coming back to the fishing story, I mean, we're also working with more and more fisher folk on all sides of the continent who are certainly experiencing, more and more of this level of extraction by Chinese trawlers and others that are essentially decimating the oceans. And again, I think it's going to take quite a collective struggle, to challenge some of that. Yeah.
We seem to be having problems with Bill's connection. Thank you for that, Pooven. There's some great comments coming in. I just have to read this from Robin Chalmers. And thanks for joining us, Robin. She says, this conversation is so important, one only has to consider that an open pit copper mine was recently improved for development in the lower Zambezi National Park. The mine, called Kangalui and owned by Mwembeshi Resources Limited, will have a potentially devastating impact not only on tourism, but the people, water, land, and environment in the entire Southern African region. A coalition of NGOs recently launched a hard-hitting campaign called Save Zambezi, to raise awareness about the issue. People who are appalled by this development can sign a petition on change.org at www.change.org/Save Zambezi. So yeah, I mean, that's certainly something worth looking into. And again, you know, during our travels through Africa, Paplak and I, we were on the Copper Belt, and you know, so much of the Copper Belt now is backed by Chinese capital, and that region, you know, a lot of that region is just a wasteland, quite frankly. So thank you for that, Robin. You know, I want to go back to, first of all, I was hoping Bill could be here, and hopefully we can get him back. But just to touch on this roads issue. So in 2011, we were in the Samburu Plain, northern Kenya, where Ian Douglas Hamilton, one of the world's great elephant conservationists, was fighting almost single-handedly an uptick in poaching, in ivory poaching that had, or elephant poaching for ivory, that had developed off this road, off this highway that was linking Nairobi to Addis Ababa. And it had got to the point where the local Turkana villages were given the equivalent of 2 months' salary to go out and mow the elephants down with AK-47s. It was really easy for them to then detusk the elephants and get the ivory into a waiting taxi, because the cell phone penetration had now reached this area as well. And this had contributed greatly to Kenya's elephant population falling from what was 180,000 in the early 90s, thanks to the work of people like Richard Leakey and Douglas Hamilton itself. So the population had fallen down to 90,000. And I forget his name, that amazing 7-foot Chinese basketball player. I forget the name, it was a long time ago. But he championed the effort to get the ivory trade banned in China. And Ian Douglas Hamilton was directly involved in that. So there again is an example of a victory led by environmental activism and led by awareness. So much of this has to do with awareness. And you know that better than anyone, Pooh. Then again, I mean, we've discussed this before on the on this webinar. We discussed it when we had a conversation last year with Makoma Kalakala and the late Bob Scholes, who was one of South Africa's great climate scientists and ecologists, and unfortunately he passed earlier this year after a hike in Namibia. But we were talking about the Messina Makata Special Economic Zone, and you've now become involved with that on the fringes, Pooven, and I know you're looking to get more involved, but that could be a victory as well. The latest story there is the environmental impact assessment on so many levels is illegal, and the environmental authorization was illegal, and the authorization is now being taken on High Court review for a range of reasons. And so here you've got the legal aspect and the legal challenge, and we give thanks to the likes of Christo Readers and the organizations he represents that's taking that on High Court review, because it needs to be on High Court review. But also the environmental activism here in the last year and a half, I'd say, has been quite incredible. If there's any sort of standing rock in South Africa now, it used to be Kolobeni, and that's quietened down. The Amadiba Crisis Committee, I believe, have had a wonderful victory themselves. Mark Caruso, who was the CEO of the two-penny Australian mining company, I mean, just to be polite about it, was forced to resign. And mining it doesn't look like it's going to happen. And so now the environmental activist focus has moved to the Musino-Mikado Special Economic Zone, which is a plan that's quite advanced to build an 8,000 hectare special economic zone / industrial plant, ferrochrome smelters, ferromanganese plants, its own 3,300 megawatt coal-fired power station. And this is pretty much on the banks of the Limpopo River in the Vembe biosphere. This is Baobab country. This is a South African treasure. And the backing goes all the way up to the top. I mean, President Ramaphosa backs this, and Xi Jinping backs this. And you have 9 Chinese multinationals backing this to the tune of 145 billion rand, which is the biggest biggest chunk of foreign direct investment that South Africa, has potentially gotten in the last couple of years, in the last 5 years. And we know how much we need FDI, but we certainly don't need FDI at the expense of poisoning the Limpopo River and taking away the water and the soil and the livelihoods of the 10 million Africans who live in the Limpopo River Basin. And, I mean, Bob Scholes was mentioning the 21,000 jobs that the SEZ operating company, that the Limpopo Economic Development Agency are promising off of this is absolutely ridiculous, because climate change and climate collapse is going to see that region of South Africa warming by at least twice the global average. So by 2040, it'll be impossible to work outdoors there. You'll have temperatures on the ground of 50 degrees centigrade or above. And how can 21,000 people work in those conditions? So the short-termism that we're looking at here is also something quite remarkable. Poov, if you could talk a bit about your experience with the SEZ.
Yeah, I mean, just to say a couple of things, and thanks for putting the background. I mean, I think, some amazing work being done by the communities who are mapping the area, who are looking at the sacred sites, who are really organizing themselves, with the backup of Makoma and EarthLife Africa, but also some great legal backup, as you already mentioned, and from Center for Environmental Rights, etc. And we're looking at, providing the kind of additional solidarity support in some of this work with communities there. But to say a couple of things, I think it's become clear that we absolutely can't afford any more coal. And we have to get to the point where it's criminal to do that. And, we know our, minister, Gwede Mantashe, is going to continue to, as we've seen in Kolobeni, in the West Coast, in the Special Economic Zone, he will continue to push, and, with the backing of government. So it's our responsibility as citizens of South Africa and as people living in South Africa for us to stop this, because they are not going to do this. And, part of that is going to court, part of it is through resistance. But this is leadership that's, they're not leading us, or they are, proxies of big money. And that's clear. So, based on the topic of the conversation today, I think it is about looking at, the ecocide that's going on, the genocide that's going on, And basic rights to life, to dignity, to a healthy environment, all of that's being violated given what's going on. Human rights defenders and environmental defenders are being killed, across the continent based on these kind of projects that are going on. So, it is time we really put a line in the sand. We can't afford this anymore. So any project, whether it's Chinese backed or not, in terms of coal and the types of fossil fuels, has to be stopped. Whether we try and stop that in the court, on the streets, etc., we can't afford it. We can't in 2 years' time say, okay, now we passed all of the boundaries. It's too late. We can't reverse anything. If there's any hope, that hope and that action has to happen now.
No, absolutely. And I mean, just echoing that, we've got a comment from another well-known environmentalist, Peter Borshet. It's all very well for civil society to challenge China's Belt and Road policies in Africa and thank the cosmos for their efforts, but it really needs governments to stand firm. Unfortunately, there seems to be a lack of will on the part of highly corruptible African governments to resist Chinese exploitation, which I think is entirely true. The one exception I've seen to that was in Botswana in 2013 on a dam at the confluence of the Shashe and Tate rivers. It was built by Sino-Hydro, the biggest construction company in the world, who at the time were working on, I think, 260 projects internationally. And this dam was the biggest dam, is the biggest dam in, it's called the Dikgatlong Dam, I think, if memory serves. So the biggest dam in Botswana, and we all know about Botswana's water provision problems. So the issue there was that Sino-Hydro was sending their least experienced engineers to Africa. So the juniors were coming to learn on the job in Africa, and then once they'd got a bit of experience on this continent, on our continent, they'd then be moved to South America or Southeast Asia, where Sino-Hydro's so-called more prestige projects were located, and the workmanship was shoddy and was just passing through. I mean, it was just getting by, and after a while, I think it was in July 2013. Cracks started to appear in that dam wall, and Ian Kama, who was the president at the time, kicked Sino-Hydro out, which was an unprecedented move, but which shows that it can be done. So in this choice that many African nations now have, are you going to accept investment from the West, which comes with its conditions, so structural adjustment policies and liberalization of markets, where basically you're opening your markets up for Western exploitation? Are you going to do that? Or are you going to go with China, where you have this infrastructure for resources swap? So through the first decade of the 20th century, that looked like the much better option. And you had these amazing diplomats from the Chinese Foreign Ministry, and we met many of them, who had been on the continent for up to 40 years. So whereas the Western governments would appoint an ambassador here for 3 years and then he's an ambassador to Chile, the Chinese Foreign Ministry would keep their African diplomats in Africa. And these guys were amazing Africa hands, and they knew the conditions on the ground, and they knew how to deal with the sensitivities. But they didn't have nearly as much hand in policy as the Commerce Ministry. So once the Commerce Ministry came in, it was just all about the infrastructure build, doing it as quickly as possible, doing it as cheaply as possible, and steamrolling everyone and everything, including the environment, to push whatever they needed to push through. And, again, back to Peter Borshet's comment, it's all well and good for civil society to challenge. But, it's not only is it all well and good, and thank you for that, Peter, but it's imperative. I mean, we're seeing and we're speaking about the victories that the environmental activists like Pooven and Natural Justice are having across this continent. And with Makoma Kalakala on the special economic zone, given her track record, working very closely with Pooven in getting that Russian nuclear deal squashed, bringing the same sort of pressure to bear on the special economic zone. But we need the African governments to push back, and our government's certainly not pushing back. There was a question about Namibia. The Namibian government's certainly not pushing back. The Zimbabwean government has never pushed back against the Chinese. I mean, Zimbabwe is more and more becoming sort of an outlying province of China. I mean, I don't think it's euphemism to say that. So, yeah, I mean, we can't expect the governments to do this of their own volition. The environmental activists and the general human rights activists need to hold our own governments to account on this exact point. We have just some more comments I want to go into here. Excuse me. Poov, is there anything else you want to come in with? Please.
Yeah, just to add a few things while you're looking at the other comments. Yeah, I mean, just, as Namibia was brought up, what we're also seeing is governments having a stake in these projects, as in, with this Okavango Delta, this is a Canadian company, Recon Africa. Namibia has a 10% stake in that in terms of oil and gas and other forms of fracking in the, biodiverse Okavango Delta, which is obviously a massive problem, which is being challenged now. But, it's so intertwined. Sometimes it's, you see a lot of these multinational companies as, being like the fourth arm of government, because, often they kind of calling the shots. But also, often, the old economic arguments of, in terms of bringing jobs, etc. I mean, what we have seen is high levels of inequality, like we know in South Africa and in other countries. We know the conditions in which people are employed and work in menial jobs as opposed to the highly kind of technical jobs. So, it's a continued form of slave labor, essentially, but, in the name of development, in the name of jobs. So I think this, the time we're in right now has to give us that opportunity to fundamentally shift how we think about economies, how we do things, looking at, what's going to be sustainable. And one of the things we've been exploring with Indigenous and local communities and others that are thinking through this is looking at the activism on the one hand, looking at ancient wisdom and Indigenous knowledge and how that's so crucial for the time we're in now. And then looking at the alternatives that communities and activists and other people are coming up with. And I think, that's where we really need to be focusing. Part of it is the resistance to the disruption, but the other part is, really looking at new ways of being on this planet, because if we don't do that, then I mean, it's going to be a turbulent ride ahead, as it already is.
Yeah, absolutely, Pooven. I mean, we're really on the same page with so much of this. And I think, again, the example of Kolobeni, the activism on the one side, but on the other side, the indigenous farming practices, which have been kept intact because of the Pondo Rebellion. So the apartheid state never managed to get into Pondo land and, come in with their monoculture and put all of those villages in locations. If you visit Pondo land now, you'll see a way of living on the land and with the land that has, survived in harmony with the land since time immemorial. The swapping of crops, the same crops in the same field, the using of kraal manure as opposed to fertilizer, homesteads evenly placed over the land. And it's no coincidence that because of all of these practices, you're seeing rainfall of 1,500 millimeters a year on average up that coast, because it all is one system. And these are the indigenous farming practices that we're talking about. And this is not something that you learn from a book. You go down to Ponderland and you see how the Pondo farmers do it. One of the major crops down there is one of the best strains of cannabis in the world. And there are some amazingly brave and smart individuals that are working at getting that properly owned by the Pondos, held by the Pondos, and released into an exploding international medical cannabis market. And these are the entirely new models that we're talking about. A comment here from Alaudin Torbani, and this is again, it's going back to this point, but it needs to be emphasized. Kevin, we have in South Africa 3 elephants: the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, the Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries, and the Department of Water and Sanitation, who are known supporting polluters. Who are supporting polluters such as mining companies who continue to pollute and without providing adequate financial provisions for environmental rehabilitation liabilities. And that's another major problem. Nobody in this country is enforcing the rehabilitation of the environment that these mining companies promise when they go in. And very often the environmental authorizations are given in the full knowledge that this land can never be rehabilitated. So if we've got, and we're coming to the end of our session, but if we have got conditions like this running as a matter of course out of South Africa's own government, where our structures for policing this, from the Environmental Assessment Practitioners Association of South Africa, who can't police our EAPs, who are the guys who put together the environmental impact assessments. And they're doing this on behalf of clients. And these clients are very often mining companies. So we have the fox running the hen house all the way through and all the way up to our ministers like Gwede Mantashe, like Barbara Creasy, and whoever is, I think there's a new Minister of Water and Sanitation. Is it still Lindiwe Sisulu? I haven't been following this. But I do know about DEF and DMRE. So, we have a ridiculous situation where it's the DMRE itself is giving environmental authorizations to mining companies, which is, it's just, that is absolutely ridiculous. So when you've got the massive Chinese multinationals coming in and operating in those conditions, no wonder they get away with what they get away with. And what we need to do as media and as environmental activists and as academics is just make as big a noise as possible and keep on taking it to the courts, like you guys have just done amazingly with that 615 paragraph submission on the Sasol and Eni offshore oil drilling fiasco. So we're coming to an end now, and we'd like to thank all of our viewers. We'd like to thank all of our Burning Planet supporters, all of Daily Maverick supporters, all of our Maverick insiders. We'd like to thank APSA again for making this possible. And we encourage you to sign up to the Our Burning Planet newsletter. It's for free. We're putting it out every 2 weeks now, every fortnight. We strongly stand by our reporting. We strongly stand by investigative pieces. We're going forward with as much conviction and strength as possible. And we thank you so much for your support. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Pooven, and thank you, Bill, who unfortunately we lost the connection, but his input and his comments were invaluable. Goodbye, everybody.